right, guys, welcome back to Revive School. Here we are, a brand new week, and it's going to be a fun one. We're finally getting to the end of Ezekiel. Okay, we got three more days of a lot more chapters to unpack. Oh, don't worry, the end times, it's fine. That's really how it unfolds, and then we're going to transition in the major prophets to our fifth and final book of the major prophets. We're going to get into the book of Daniel. I don't know about you guys, but when we've been studying the major prophets, and I know as I've been traveling and teaching through this as well, it just seems to me the students, it creates this new hunger. It's kind of like, wow, I've never seen that before. Or like, I know I've read this before. I know I've heard about the Valley of Dry Bones. I know I've heard a couple things, in Jeremiah about my future, or I heard about the guy in Isaiah running around naked. I've heard a couple things like this. But the reality is, Kevin, what I have seen is that I have never really been able to start putting it together. And I think that's been our prayer, you guys, here at Revive School, is that, it's called Revive School. It's a complete portrait of the Messiah, that you would begin to see the Messiah in every single book of the Bible. And, it really is an honor. It's a privilege. We finally actually have the painter actually in the studio, my cousin, Mindy Oaten. Mindy, welcome to the Revive School studio.
It's a pleasure.
But Rich, I think she just waved to your computer screen.
I don't know what I'm
Hi, guys.
Just look at Kyle.
That was awesome. Hi, camera. So anyway, Mindy has been faithfully painting. I mean, man, here we have Isaiah, Jeremiah. We have Lamentations up on our set here. But now here we have Ezekiel. And so, I don't know, Mindy, is there something specific? What's this process been like for you? Just in general, painting through the books of the Bible.
Just the paint has been the way that the Lord speaks to me through the Bible, and it's been an incredible experience.
And give us a visual. Where are you painting?
I have a studio in my basement.
And you're in Canada.
Yeah, in Canada. And I have all the little thumbnails, like your little ones there, along the ceiling of my studio. So I have my own little timeline going on too. So it's fun to see it here, and it's replicated where I'm at.
It's just been a crazy journey, hasn't it? It's been a wild journey. I mean, who would have thought from the farmlands of North Dakota of us just playing out in the junkyard, right?
Yeah.
To here we be in Dallas talking about Ezekiel, let alone the Millennial Temple. I mean, that's what we're going to get into today. I mean, yesterday, Pastor Fred Staten was walking through Ezekiel 40 and 41, and really I have the honor to cover up 42 as well. But really, Kevin, 40, 41, and 42 is about what?
Dimensions.
The dimensions. It's about the dimensions of this temple. Now remember, you have multiple temples already up to this point. That's where it gets confusing, okay? So here you have the very first temple. If you want to go to the Kings and Prophets for me. Here you have the very first temple. David wanted to build it. He couldn't do it. Too much bloodshed, too much issues. So then God allows his son, Solomon, to build it. So here you have the first temple, right? So that's the first temple that we talk about. The problem is, in all of this process, Kevin, what happens to that temple?
It gets destroyed and burned to the ground.
It gets destroyed and burned to the ground, and then what do? We write about it, right? We lament about it, right? Jeremiah is lamenting about this temple that is destroyed. So then all of these people that are participating in the presence of God, then they're either destroyed at the Assyrian captivity, okay? But the reality is that they're thrown into Babylonian captivity. So here they are in the Babylonian captivity from 586 and on, and Kevin, in their mind, they have no temple. Right? So this is the process that we're beginning to get into. And so Ezekiel is in the heart. He's at the canal, right? He's in as an exile. And he's saying, guys, I know it's really bad, but don't worry, there's something better coming. Now, what he describes, Kevin, is not the second temple. Would you agree?
Correct.
He is describing, it could be called the third temple. It could be called the Millennial Temple. There could be distinctions between those two, right, Kevin? I mean, that's pretty clear. That's where it gets a little fuzzy here, is that you have to have a third temple in order for the Antichrist to come and say, hey, by the way, I'm God, right? So we know that there's going to be a process of a third temple. But what we get into today is, if you want to call it the third or the fourth, I'm okay with that. But for our conversation, we'll call it the Millennial Temple. Okay, so that's the Millennial Temple that we're talking about in Ezekiel 40, 41, and 42. It's not the same one that Solomon built. And in fact, it's not the same one on the second one, right, as Zerubbabel or the Herod's temple, correct? So, and then that one got destroyed. The second one got destroyed. Kevin, you remember that time frame?
70 AD.
70 AD. So you have 586 first temple, 70 AD second temple. So now what we're describing in Ezekiel 40, 41, and 42 is the millennial temple. Is that the same temple that was in motion from the third temple? Kevin, you got any thoughts on that? Rich?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
I just think here's the deal. Whenever you get into the end time stuff, I'm presenting this. I think that's half the battle in class. I always loved, I was with an Old Testament professor at Dallas Theological Seminary. I always sat in the back row. I never talked except one time I got made fun of. So then I stopped talking all my life in that class and never talked. And they asked the professor, hey, do you know about this? And you know what he said? I don't know. I don't know. And so I think that's the point, you guys. Don't force something into a box if we don't know that that's the box it's supposed to be in. So when we're talking about the millennial temple, what we do know is this. Rich, when you call it the millennial temple, what are we implying?
We're calling it that Christ has come back.
What would be the millennial even refers to just he's back and for 1,000 years.
It's his reign.
It's his reign, and there's a temple that actually is there, right? So Kevin, you want to go up to the millennial temple that we referenced even yesterday in class. And so this is the one we're talking about, okay? And in fact, it was shown as a vision. And so here they describe it as, even the third temple. That's where it gets a little bit sticky, okay? But we do know this is one that's going to take place in the 1,000-year reign. All right, I think, Kevin, we've got it set up. Anything else? Any other questions on the millennial? I'm sure Mindy, why didn't you paint the millennial temple?
That could be a whole painting in itself.
So here's what's fun about this. In Ezekiel 43, okay, verse 1, it says this. He led me to the gate, the one that faces east. Anytime I hear east in Jerusalem, I get excited. Well, there's kind of a lot of layers, but here's why. In verse 2, it says, I saw the glory of the God of Israel coming from the east. Okay, Rich, you've always been good with geography. What is to the east of Jerusalem? What's the mountain that's right there?
Mount of Olives.
Mount of Olives is on the east. And in Zechariah 14, I think, Kevin, isn't it? Zechariah 14:4, it talks about how Jesus is coming back to the Mount of Olives. This is Zechariah 14. On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, look at this, which faces Jerusalem on the east. So here you have the Messiah is going to actually come on the Mount of Olives, faces Jerusalem on the east. And then this is the best part. The Mount of Olives is going to be split in half from east to west, forming a huge valley. There's already one there. Now it's got another one. So that half the mountain will move to the north and half to the south. So when you hear in verse 2, I saw the glory of God of Israel coming from the east, you should automatically jump to Zechariah, which we haven't even got into yet, but we just read. Zechariah prophesies, guess what? The Messiah is coming back from the east. And so when you see in Ezekiel these words and how they're the contemporaries and how they're painting this picture, I saw the glory of the God of Israel coming from the east. Right away, you should have a picture of the coming Messiah. His voice sounded like the roar of mighty waters, and the earth shone with his glory. Now, here's what's interesting. In chapters 8 through 11 in Ezekiel, Kevin, I'm kind of testing your mind now. What happened with the glory of God? Do you remember in chapters 8 through 11?
And actually, he watched it leave.
Yeah, the glory of God actually left. So now here we are saying the glory of God is coming back. But Kevin, there's no physical temple in Jerusalem, right?
Because it's been destroyed.
It's been destroyed. What he's seeing is something that actually is not being built right now in Jerusalem, but it is yet to come. The reason people get intimidated by prophecy or understanding prophets is timing. When is he talking about this? The millennial temple is 1,000 years. When is that? It's right after the tribulation, which, Kevin, how long is the tribulation?
7 years.
7 years. Kevin, you had to freeze for a second there. Watch.
Lots of different words that...
Here you have the tribulation, okay? And we know that you have 3.5 years, and boy, oh boy, we're going to get into that with Daniel this week. It's a lot. 3.5 years, right? You got peace, 3.5 years of just wrath. Then you have Jesus. He comes. And then what does that happen? What happens there? Then you have the millennium, right? And in this process, you have a temple. Okay? So you have to understand when we're talking millennial temple, this is where we're at. Now, Kevin, we are currently in what we would just call the current age. I don't know what else you call this. That's where we're at. We have not had a peace agreement yet that's been taking place with the Antichrist and with Israel and with other nations that says, hey, we're not going to have any fighting. So we're not in this tribulation period yet. but we have to be like watchmen and get prepared and look for these type of things. So in this process, okay, now this is kind of cool. He says in verse 3, he says, the vision I saw was like the one I had seen when he came to destroy the city, and like the ones I'd seen by the Chebar Canal, I fell face down. So he's obviously overwhelmed with the presence of God. And he says this, in verse 4, the glory of the Lord entered the temple by way, and without even reading it, you should know it's coming from the east, by way of the gate that faced east. Rich, one of my favorite things in Jerusalem is the eastern gate. What's so weird right now about the eastern gate in Jerusalem?
Well, there's a couple of things. One, it's currently walled up. And two, there's currently a Muslim cemetery right in front of it.
It's crazy. So here's what you have to understand. You have three major religions: Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And every one of them anticipates the Messiah coming back from the east. Every one of them. It's insane. So what are we going to do with the Jews? Well, we're going to cement it up, because in Ezekiel, this is where they go. So when the Jews are talking about the Messiah coming back, when they're talking about the glory of the Lord coming back, they realize that it's coming here, which Ezekiel prophesies about. And what is he doing? He's describing the temple that you have right here. And oh, by the way, this is going to be built, and the Messiah, the presence of God, is coming back. The Muslims don't like it because they don't think it's going to happen. But just in case, let's make sure. And then as Christians, we're excited because we believe in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. We actually believe the glory of the Lord is going to be coming back. And then it says in verse 5, then the Spirit lifted me up, describing Ezekiel, lifted me up, brought me to the inner court. And so Kevin, he literally brought him right here into the inner court. He drops Ezekiel, and the glory of the Lord, look at this, in the inner court filled the temple. Like, we haven't had this since Ezekiel 8, 9, 10, and 11. Why? Because the presence of God, it was almost like, remember, he went to the threshold, and then what does the presence of God do? He leaves. And so if you're in exile, if you're at the Chebar Canal, if you're in Babylon, you're like, God has left us. And now all of a sudden you're hearing the presence of God is coming back. To me, it's an incredible picture, but what are the things that need to happen? Okay, I'm totally going to go on a rabbit trail for a second. What are some of the things that need to happen in order for the timing of this to all line up? Okay, so yeah, you have a millennial temple, but what needs to happen in order for the presence of God to come back? Well, just a couple things, okay? A guy named Mike Bennett just kind of really just spells out some lists. I'm not going to write it down, but just some things to watch for. Whenever I have Mindy and interact with Mindy, whether we're, in whatever state together, you always have this presence of being a watchman. That's kind of your heartbeat. You kind of have this in tune, functioning as a prophetess. So what are some things that we should be looking for? One is religious deception. You should be looking for religious deception. You should be understanding that there's going to be wars and rumors of wars. Okay? You should understand that there's going to be famines, pestilences, earthquakes. You should start seeing persecution of Christ followers. Like, we shouldn't be alarmed when people in China hear these stories that the governments are coming in and they're completely destroying churches. You shouldn't be alarmed that believers in Cameroon or believers in another country are being persecuted. These things, look, we don't welcome them, we don't get excited about them, but we should expect them. These things should start happening in order for Ezekiel 43 to begin to actually take place. You got to start seeing these things unfold. You should see lawlessness. And yet at the same time, you should see the good news continue to be delivered. It's a crazy picture of all of this has to take place, you guys, before the Millennium Temple actually is built. I'm trying to put a timeline here, and you got to understand, as all of this is taking place, then we'll begin to jump into the tribulation. You should begin to see, literally, as what Bennett says, the threatening of the existence of humanity should be considered like we might lose all of humanity. Like, that's how bad the tribulation is going to be. Not the first 3.5 years, but the second. You should understand people will begin. Even if you watch the news, you guys, it's kind of interesting. Every week now, I think for the last month, I've heard about somebody talking about a different asteroid that could come and wipe out the U.S., that could come and wipe out all of the earth. Like, they're talking like these studies of like, do you see that there could be a wipeout of all of humanity? Like, just maybe they had these conversations, but the point is these things should be taking place. Now you have to understand something. So now we've heard the presence of God, the glory of God is filling the temple. Okay, this is the millennial temple that we're talking about. In verse 6, here's the significance behind it. It says, while the man was standing beside me. Okay, now this is probably the individual, you guys, earlier on, that's walking Ezekiel through these visions. While the man was standing beside me, I heard somebody speaking to me from the temple. It's a cool picture. He said to me, "Son of man, this is the place of my throne and the place for the soles of my feet, where I will dwell among the Israelites forever." You know, when I hear this, Kevin, can you go to Psalm 132? When I hear about this, like, if I'm Ezekiel, I'm like, God? Right? I mean, this is, in Psalm 132, it has this picture, right, of Jerusalem being its home. Kevin, can you go to, let's see, Psalm 132, 13. Go to 13, please. It says, "For the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his home." And look what it says. Keep going. "This is my resting place forever. I will make my home here because I have desired it." Clearly, through the psalmist, God is saying, this is my place. So they know this. And then in Ezekiel 8 through 11, he leaves. But Kevin, he's a God that keeps his promises. And so what do you see when you go back to Ezekiel 43? When you go back to verse 7, he says, "I will dwell among the Israelites forever." And you're like, yes, God, you kept your promises. "The house of Israel and their kings will no longer defile my name by their religious prostitution." What do we mean by that? Religious prostitution. Well, it's pretty obvious. They have these false idols. They're welcoming the foreigners. When they welcome the foreigners, don't take this into any racist comment. This is just the reality back then. They brought in the foreigners, and Kevin, what do the foreigners bring?
Other religions and idols.
Yeah, they bring their other religions, they bring their other idols. So because of that, they're experiencing religious prostitution. And by the corpses of their kings at their high places. So now all of a sudden, they're participating in the high places, they're bringing in the false idols. And he says no more. He continues on in verse 8. "Whenever they place their threshold next to my threshold and their doorpost beside my doorpost, with only a wall between me and them, they were defiling my holy name by the abominations they committed. So I destroyed them in my anger." I'm done with that stuff. I'm done with how they've been living. And then he says in verse 9, "Now let them remove their prostitution in the corpses of the kings far from me, and I will dwell among them forever." It's kind of ridiculous, to be honest, how merciful God is with the people of Israel. Like, it's over and over and over. They make a mistake. God's like, seriously? But I'm going to be with them forever. I mean, this is the process. And then he says this in verse 10. Remember, he's already described how he's going to build it. Now in verse 10, he says, "As for you," this is really interesting. There's a change of heart here. "Describe the temple to the house of Israel." I want you to describe this. That's what he says. I need you to describe the outer court, the inner court, the river of life, the lower pavement. I need you to describe the priest's kitchen. I want you to describe everything. And then he says, "so that they may be ashamed of their iniquities." Like, I want them to see that because my presence is going to be here, Scripture says they will be ashamed of their sin. Kind of an interesting picture. "Let them measure its pattern, and they will be ashamed of all that they have done." Reveal the design of the temple to them, its layout with its exits and its entrances, its complete design, along with all of its statutes. That these are described, you guys, in chapters 40, 41, and 42. Design specifications and laws. Write it down in their sight so that they may observe its complete design in all its statutes and may carry them out. So, like, in other words, when they see how glorious this is, Lord willing, then they'll be repentant of their past and get excited about the presence of God. It's almost like, this is a horrible illustration, but it's almost like if we're the church. This is not a comparison in the sense because, like, he's clearly talking to the Israelites. But it's almost like you have to show, like, the church, like, what it could look like. It's almost like you have to show the church, like, this is really how God designed heaven to come here on earth. And then in that, because of what Christ has done, maybe that would lead us to repentance. Maybe that would lead us to confession. Maybe we would realize all that Christ has done and that what he's offering us, that actually might lead us to a time of turning to him again. Like, this is the image. That's what we're after here, of understanding and being in the experience, in the presence of God. He continues on, Kevin, in verse 12. "This is the law of the temple. All its surrounding territory on top of the mountain will be especially holy." Yes, this is the law of the temple. What you're going to see now is okay, there's this prayer, first of all. Please turn to the Lord, the reality, because I just described the temple. I think it's an interesting approach. But they know, and you guys still, Jewish people today, can expect that the presence of God, the glory of God, is going to come from the east, and he's going to fill his presence in the new temple. So again, you have to go back to this weird question. Currently, right now, in what they call Old City Jerusalem, is Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. You have the Western Wall, and then you have two holy sites for Muslim folks. The argument has been is that what? The temple was there. The argument has been historically, this is the Temple Mount where so many things happened. Mount Moriah, so that what would they say? Well, this is where Abraham attempted to sacrifice Isaac. This is where the temple was. This is really where the presence of God was. So if we're talking about a millennial temple, Kevin, the only thing I can conclude is that somewhere, somehow, that has to be built where the Temple Mount is. Man, I don't have a clue, nor am I predicting. All I'm just saying is that somewhere in this period of peace, 3.5 years of wrath, I wonder if God's going to shake it up somehow, that He'll release it so that this can be built. Because we do know this, He's coming back. And this is the description of Ezekiel 43, the millennial temple. So what you're going to see is really in verses 13 through 27. John MacArthur calls it the measurements of the altar. That's really what you see. The measurements of the altar, he begins to get really, really detailed of really what this looks like. So let me just read a couple examples. In verse 13, it says this: these are the measurements of the altar. And just so you know, this is for burnt offerings. These are the measurements of the altars in units of length, okay? Each unit being the standard length plus 3 inches. The gutter. Who would even thought they're talking about a gutter here? It must rain a lot. The gutter is 21 inches deep, just kidding, 21 inches wide with a rim of 9 inches around its edge. This is the base of the altar. The distance from the gutter on the ground to the lower edge is 3.5 feet. And the width of the ledge is 21 inches. There are 7 feet from the small ledge to the large ledge, whose width is also 21 inches. The altar hearth is 7 feet high, and 4 horns project upward from the hearth. Mindy, I was looking for that in your painting. This is ridiculously detailed here, is what you see. And I think one of the things, I want to get to this at the end, one of the things that I wrestle with, I'm a New Covenant believer, which just means in the New Testament it talks about Jesus, and it talks about how He died for us, He was buried, He came back to life. I believe that Christ is the Messiah. Okay, that seems to be, Kevin, like a Matthew through Revelation belief. Right? I mean, that's kind of the thought, right? So in Genesis through Malachi, what do you have? You have people participating with a temple and sacrifices and, offering up things for forgiveness. So combine the Old Testament sacrifices, and then you have Jesus in the New Testament. And then, Kevin, at the end of these two, you have the millennial temple. And guess what? These worlds combine in this place. That's really hard to process, isn't it?
Yeah, even in chapters to come, it's hard to process.
It's totally hard. So here you have, in the millennial temple, a description where the presence of God, Jesus is going to be in Jerusalem. At the same time, you're going to see sacrifices being offered at this place. Am I right? Rich, did I miss anything?
No, you got it.
So don't check out because it's in Ezekiel 43 and it's a prophet talking about a third or the millennial temple. You're like, I don't need to kill a lamb. Well, according to this, we might have to get ready. Now, look, I understand there's going to be specific roles that people like, we might not have to be building this. That's not my point. My point is these worlds will combine. And really what you see, you guys, in verses 18 through 29 is that the burnt offerings then are described. So we've talked about the measurements of the altar, of how to build these things. And then in 18 and through 29, then you actually hear the burnt offerings and how they are described. And it really goes all the way through the process. I mean, you're supposed to give a young bull for a sin offering. On the second day, you're supposed to offer a ram free of blemishes as a sin offering. It continues on even into 23, then another bull and then another ram in the inner court. And then in this process, in verse 24, then you got to throw salt, right, on the process. The priests are going to throw salt on them to sacrifice as a burnt offering to the Lord. Interesting enough, okay, I just have to say this because we're going to get into Ezekiel. It's crazy stuff coming up. Kevin, you see where it just says throw salt on them? Eventually, right, remember how we talked about this river? Have we gotten to the river? We haven't gotten to the river. And so part of it says everything has been cleansed. The Dead Sea has been totally cleansed, except there's a part around the swamps and the valleys that they still have salt. Some people would say that God preserved certain things for this salt so that they could continue the sacrifices. Kind of an interesting picture of how God puts all of this together. So priests are throwing salt on them. They're sacrificing a burnt offering to the Lord. And then it says in verse 25, by the way, you're going to offer a goat for a sin offering for 7 days. A young bull, a ram for the flock, unblemished, but also must be offered. I have to admit, I'm exhausted just even reading through these things to try to keep up. I kind of thought, hey, I thought we're done with this kind of stuff. All I know is this. Jesus says in Matthew 5:17, I didn't come to abolish or to destroy what the law and the prophets talked about. He says, I came to fulfill. Clearly, Jesus is the picture of the ultimate sacrifice. Clearly, Jesus is all we need in order to experience, yes, life after death. By no means am I at all communicating that these offerings bring you eternal life. But I will tell you this, Jesus put it all together at the end. And what Ezekiel sees in all of this is that all of this is going to take place in Ezekiel's temple, in the Millennial temple. And is it hard to understand? Is it hard to grasp? You know, it kind of is. I don't have any problem saying this, but I will tell you this. You know, I was reading through some stuff from John MacArthur, and I know we've already said this, that only Christ can take away the sins. That's pretty clear. But just maybe some of those offerings, some of those sacrifices, okay, are to paint a picture, maybe, about how Christ completely fulfilled those. I know that maybe that's a weird thought for some people, but like think about this with the bread and the cup. Why do we participate with the bread and the cup?
To remember.
To remember. Maybe if we take the bread and the cup as new covenant believers, just a thought, maybe the Old Testament believers, okay, that have been waiting for the Messiah to come, now that they're here in the Millennial temple, maybe some of those offerings are a remembrance of like, this is what we've been talking about the whole time. It's Christ. Like it could be just a picture. Just hear me out on this. Like I don't know. But I do think it's a cool picture if we have the bread and the cup and then they need to have those type of things. God can do that. So here you have Ezekiel 43. If you're open to that thought, you might actually believe, let me say this, that Jesus is actually after to save the Jews. You might actually believe that God has a bigger picture than just us. That He's bigger than what we always see. I don't know, this is a cool picture. Ezekiel 43, I know we're supposed to cover, I think, Kevin, we're supposed to cover Ezekiel 44, but you know, welcome to Revive School. This is called a fire hose. You try to drink as much as you can and try to process as much as you can. But I will just say in Ezekiel 44, you really begin to see 1 through 9 is how do you use the temple? And I like what Tom Constable says. And then in 10 through 31, how the priests were to use the temple. All right, guys, Ezekiel 42, 43, and 44. Don't worry, it continues on tomorrow. Have a great day. We'll talk to you later.